Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, are you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans? It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. David Hensley, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers at home.
Hi, I'm David Hensley. I write military sci-fi and post-apocalyptic science fiction for Three Ravens and a little bit of military space opera for Canon Publishing.
All right, and if you read the title, keep going. There's more.
I'll carry on, man.
So if you read the title of this episode, obviously it's a book that Dave and I co-wrote. So I am J.R. Handley, a military veteran of the late unpleasantness in Mesopotamia. I took up writing as a therapy class. Writing as therapy literally was the name of this class. And I got hooked, I guess. I started with sci-fi because it felt a little less visceral than, fantasy sword fights up close and personal. And I needed that at the time with the PTSD classes. And then somewhere along the line, I just started having fun. I think I've always told stories in my head. For me, the mark of a good book was when I put it down, did I keep the story going in my head, putting myself in as a shameless self-insert and what I would do in that world, mostly with all the cool magic powers that world had, because why not? So did you ever do that, Dave, when you were reading?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all the time. Heck, man, as a kid coming up, man, I had the Choose Your Own Adventure. They had like a role-playing version of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and Lankamar stuff, and man, I wanted to be Fafhrd or the Grey Mouser so bad I could taste it, and or Tarzan of the Apes, to the point where I tried to swing out of a tree holding onto a rope, and I discovered that my grip strength was not sufficient to keep me from sliding down the rope and smashing into the ground.
Ooh. At one point in time, my friends and I thought it would be cool because we wanted to be knights in shining armor. And so we thought it would be a great idea to grab trash can lids and brooms and joust on our bicycles. Nobody got hurt because our parents saw what the hell we were doing and are like, yeah, not only no, but hell no. And you're grounded.
Never do
this
that
is
again.
when I was, this is when I was still at base housing at Great Lakes because my stepdad was I guess you're not drill sergeants in the Navy. What do they call those?
RDCs.
Yeah,
Yep.
he was doing the drill
division instructor. Yep.
Right. He was doing that. And so we were like on the block we were on, and base housing was all of the instructors. They kind of grouped us together because as families, because they tended probably to rotate in and out at the same time. It just made it easier. And so obviously someone was always around. And so we got caught.
Yeah.
I still think I would have won. I'm just saying, I'm going to throw that out there because there's no one to prove me wrong.
Unless your childhood friends challenge you to a joust now.
Oh, crap. I might be in trouble if they did that. I hope they don't listen. Because I don't know that I'm winning that one at this point in my life. I have lived hard, as they say, rode hard and put away wet.
Heck yeah, man. I couldn't pedal a bicycle and hold on to a broomstick now. I mean, there's no way. I'd be scraping me off the asphalt.
And getting banged up in the middle. There's the iconic meme you see floating around. It's a young guy standing in front of the mirror, and it's an old guy staring back at him. And sometimes it's like in your head you didn't age, but other times the joke is, "What are you talking about? I'm only 20. I don't look a day over my age of 24." And the joke is, of course, that the military ages your body.
Yeah, in dog years.
Yeah. So, and I know people. They were in airborne division that were shorter when they got out than they went in, just because the jumps.
Yeah.
So the next part of the introduction, dear listener, is how we first found them. So I met David through Hillbilly, otherwise known as William Joseph Roberts, who owns and runs Three Ravens. I had written this book and I had to unpublish it for reasons we'll get into. And it needed a huge overhaul. And Hillbilly was basically, because he had read it, the original version, and he says, you have too much Army in your Navy. And I know a Navy guy that's looking to make his mark in the world. So he put us in contact, and we found out we don't live too far apart and had fun talking. And, here we are. Now you come on my show a lot, which I like. You're fun.
Yeah, I like it too. I like to talk.
That's why we get along so well. All right. But before we dive into this, we do have to do the religion questions. because we are the Blasters and Blades, but because I'm also interviewing myself, dear listener, I will be answering them as well. So the first one, are you ready?
Let's do it.
Farscape, Sliders, or the X-Files?
Yeah, man, I saw like 6 episodes of the X-Files and played the video game on PlayStation, and I didn't watch any of the other 2, so I'm going to go with X-Files.
Okay. I liked Farscape okay, but it felt a little campy, although it was the 90s, so everything was campy. The X-Files, I mean, they were hit or miss. Some episodes were good, some were not, but I really hated the drawn-out mystery because at a certain point in time, it's just like, give me the damn answer already. But no, we got like dozens of seasons or however many it was, I don't remember, where they just kept pushing forward. So for me, I'm going to go Sliders. I also liked the idea of multiple parallel universes. I mean, it's basically like Stargate, but instead of going to other galaxies, you're going to other dimensions, which I thought was kind of cool. And the idea that you could carry that around on a remote control. I mean, like,
dude, now I might have to go watch Sliders.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. I dug it. Some of the actors were kind of like B-grade actors, but together, the conglomeration of the cast as one, they did good. I enjoyed it. I think it ages well.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and watch it now.
It's easy to age well when you don't use a lot of like special effects.
Yeah, a lot of practical effects make it so that it kind of works no matter when you watch it.
Yeah, and I think they were focusing on the aesthetic because they kept it. I guess they kept it simpler because TVs back then you didn't have HD, so they had to make sure it held up regardless of the screen sizes.
Yeah.
So, all right, and because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Charmed, Buffy, Hercules, or Xena, Warrior Princess?
Oh, man, it's tough because I love all of those, but I'm going to have to go. Jeez, man, I really like Buffy, but I've watched every episode of the old Charmed at least twice. So, Charmed.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of a tie between Hercules or Xena, which is why both are on the list because I couldn't decide. Hercules, he's an amazing actor, and then you find out years later he was working out so hard because he was doing it all without steroids. That was what one man in a weight machine could do to himself as far as his physique. But he was working out so hard, he was having micro strokes every day, and he just kept pushing through it. And he's talked about that in interviews, and I'm like, dude, I like to think I'm kind of hardcore when I was in the Army, and I was tough because I played collegiate rugby and played for the All-Army team for a couple matches. I didn't play for a season, but I got to stand in once or twice. I don't think I'd have played through heart attack a day. Like, I don't think I'm that dedicated.
Yeah, no, no way.
And Xena, I mean, Lucy Lawless, she's the reason I have a thing for brunettes. I'm just saying it was worth the wait to see her in Spartacus. If you know, you know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, without a doubt.
I really liked that they made a nod to the fact that, like, men and women are different in that when she was beating them, the guys were like, oh, it's a girl, I'm going to kick her butt. And then, of course, she has her super magic ninja powers from the gods. And so there's an explanation of why they can kick their butt. But by the other guys acknowledging it, thinking she was going to be a pushover, if they didn't know who she was, because obviously she has a reputation in the show. Like, they kind of split the fence, and it made it believable in as much as anything with the ancient gods is believable. So I really dug that. And then her relationship with Gabriel, who starts off as like naive country bumpkin, and you see her sort of harden and get more jaded as the series goes on. And I kind of like that evolution because, I mean, that's basically everybody growing up, right? Like, you come from a simpler place and suddenly you see the real world and it's like, we ain't in Kansas anymore.
The real world sucks.
Yeah, send me back to Kansas because that sucks. Well, not really Kansas because who wants to live there? But
corn farmers.
Yeah, give me a mountain any day. And because you've been on the show so often, we do have to ask you. We normally would ask you your favorite dinosaur, but you've answered that a few times. So, what's your favorite zoo animal?
Favorite zoo animal? I'm going to go with the orangutan.
Any reason?
Yeah, those guys, like every time I'm at a zoo, regardless of which zoo I'm at, those dudes are always just kind of kicked back in the shade, chilling, scratching their junk, just hanging out.
Yeah, I enjoy the wolves. And I really dig the polar bears because most of the time they got like no F's to give. They mess with, like, they'll swim up to the little viewing stand and just tap on it and just stare at the kids and like they're just like, I don't care, whatever.
You're on the menu. I just can't get to you.
Right. And you don't really see that as much when you see the brown bears in captivity or the black bears. But the polar bears, for whatever reason, they're just like the I've got no F's to give.
Yeah.
When it comes to the bear population. And if they have them, the wildcats are always nice as well. Not all the zoos have those. I mean, you got the standard lion, but I don't think like the cheetahs and all that. Those can be fun too, if the zoo is big enough. So
yeah, like the San Diego Zoo, they have like a safari park.
Really,
Yeah, like it's this huge multi-acre, like I mean, when you're in it, it feels like you're in the middle of the African savannah, not freaking Southern California. Because it's so darn big.
That has me thinking, if the apocalypse really comes, what happens to all those now wild, not cared for, not fed, and very hungry predators that are at all the zoos?
Well, the ones that can handle the cold adaptation, I imagine there's going to be large populations of them, that are now a serious problem for a resurgent humanity.
But you say the cold, but nothing says the apocalypse has to be cold related.
Well, no, but some of those animals are not from North America, and North America is typically a little cool for them.
So if they don't have the climate control, you're saying in the zoo park that they have, that they might not survive.
Yeah, they're probably. Yeah, I don't know how that goes, but I mean they've got hippos in South America now, thanks to drug lords. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. There's speaking of that, if you're interested in to see how that plays out, I think it was BBC, maybe the Discovery Channel that put it out there, but Life After Humans, and they go after like if humans just, Thanos snapped his fingers and all of humans are gone, what happens to the world? And it talks about how quickly like nature will reclaim the cities, what happens to the Hoover Dam, what happens to all the nuclear plants, because eventually without someone tending them, it gets ugly in that region. But then with the automated processes, assuming it's not an EMP, they should also shut down and self-contain. Yeah. My understanding of the tech. So it would be a very limited cluster of suck for the nuclear plants. But it talks about all that. It's really fascinating to kind of think about. I mean, obviously it's all guesswork, but
and it's cool. That's one of my favorite things to think about.
Yeah, it's you see what happens. Like most of the dogs that are bred by humans as pets, like the little Chihuahuas and whatnot, most of them don't live. It's only the medium to large size dogs that make it, and it's only certain breeds, because apparently some of the breeds they were talking about in that episode, like they can't even reproduce without the help of humans doing the artificial, because their body issues. Like they've been bred for such weird traits.
Yeah, like the what are the dogs that the Queen has over in England? I can't remember now.
The lap dogs or what?
Yeah. They're a lap dog, but they featured in that episode.
Yeah, it's I ought to rewatch that just because it's cool. I dig a good documentary. I love Curiosity Stream for that reason. Have you ever tried any of those services?
No, I do a lot of podcasts just because I have more time with my day job driving around by myself. I can listen to endless hours of podcasts like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I just listened through his entire, he calls Wrath of the Khans, which is kind of like Genghis Khan through Kublai Khan, rise of the Mongol Empire stuff. And I bet that's 20 hours worth of content. But
I mean, his Rome alone is like 3 or 4 work weeks worth of hours.
Yeah. Dan Carlin's stuff is fantastic. Like they're like graduate level work from a dude he admittedly, he's like, I'm not a historian. I'm just a fan of history. But man, his stuff is good.
Yeah, I really loved it too. I remember his one about World War I and how that affected the entirety of modern history, like the knockoff effects. And everyone thinks, well, World War I calls World War II, but there's more to it than that. And he did a breakdown, and like, if obviously you don't see the graphs because he's talking about, but like huge chunks were, because in Europe the regimental system was so prevalent, when a unit got hit hard, it wasn't just that Britain lost 1,000 men. It's the village of Bumfrick Nowhere lost 1,000 of their young men. And so entire villages died on the vine or became like, wastelands where only females were living, which is, really hard if you need to repopulate because you got another war in 40 years.
Yeah. That's why they ended up with that whole policy of appeasement,
Yeah. But everyone obviously thinks of that, but then they don't think of like what that does to the national psyche, how that affected economies across the globe, and some of the political policies that were put into place because of this. It's really fascinating to think about, and that's one of the things I think a lot of people, both in writing and just in general, forget is the knock-on effects of every action. If this, then that, and if that, then what? And if you can't answer those questions, I think the story suffers.
Absolutely.
So I really dig the podcast too. Is there anything else you're listening to as far as podcasting goes? Obviously, ours.
Yeah, there's Blasters and Blades, but Hardcore History. Also, Mike Rose, The Way I Heard It. Like that dude. Yeah. Gets into deep dive, hour and a half long conversations with such a broad spectrum of people.
You know what he was doing when he started that?
Yeah, he was doing it was like an homage to Paul Harvey.
Yeah, Paul Harvey, and that's the rest of the story. In fact, there's one of those stories that still sticks out. Like this kid's, I'll remember this because I was a kid when I heard it. Paul Harvey was telling the story. This kid asked for a dog, and the dad was like, "When hell freezes over," and the next year, some country in Sweden or whatever literally froze over, and the dad had to buy the kid a dog.
Get a dog, yeah. Yeah, I grew up listening to the Paul Harvey stuff on the radio.
Oh, absolutely. Right. He came right before or right after the top 40 countdown?
Oh, geez. It was midday. It was always at at the noon hour, right around that time frame, if I remember right.
The cool thing is Micro got permission from Paul Harvey's family to do what he was doing. I mean, he didn't need it, but he did it anyway. Which they wrote him he read the letter a letter that they wrote him, that Paul Harvey's son had written him on the podcast at one point. Yeah, in the beginning. And Micro is just pretty cool anyway, because there's lots of dirty jobs you just don't even realize are jobs. So it's kind of cool. But
and what I love about Roe is like his refusal to gloss over and put a shiny finished look on things. Like the guy very much goes for, hey, this is the way it is. Sometimes there's warts, sometimes there's not, and half the time I don't know. Like he's 100% happy to say, you know what, man, I don't know. He is so happy to be uncertain about things and unapologetically uncertain that I really enjoy that, listening to him talk to people about very important stuff.
My favorite was when he does a lot of interviews because he has the Micro Foundation where he's basically like when we were kids in school, we were told if you went to trade schools because you were too stupid for college. And it was like an insult for you to consider trade school.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously we know like there are plumbers that make 3 times as much as some doctors are making. Or as much as some of these white collar professionals. So, I mean, if you've got some of those trades, if you're willing to work hard, the sky's the limit for you. Because those are certain jobs you just can't outsource. Nope. And so he was shilling for the Micro Foundation, where he provides scholarships to underprivileged young people or people with criminal past that want a second chance. And they send them obviously to trade school to get certified to then go do the job. And CNN tried to ambush him on one of those interviews about his own criminal past. And he's like, yeah, I messed up. I overcame, and here we are. Don't you believe in second chances? And I really do. I believe we should give everyone a second chance. And a lot of people say that, but they don't put their money where their mouth is. So I really love that he doesn't shy away from that. And he's like, yeah. And
yep. Absolutely. I love that he is dedicated to authenticity.
Yeah. It's sad that that's what sticks out because it's so rare.
Yep.
So, all right. So we'll move this shindig on because otherwise we'll talk about other people's podcasts and not our book. Right. So obviously we both served in the military. So I'm going to ask you, do you think your time in the United States Navy, and you spent 20 something years as a helicopter mechanic?
Yep. 20 years as an aviation structural mechanic, which is essentially fixing everything on the helicopter that's not an engine or an electrical system or an ejection seat. I spent 20 years doing that for the Navy, and then another 6-ish years doing that after I retired as a DoD contractor working on Navy equipment. So roughly 27 years of experience as a Navy aircraft mechanic.
So with that experience, do you feel like that affects the way you tell stories?
Yeah, without a doubt, especially if I can find a way to write in that aspect of the Navy stuff, right? Like if I'm telling a story that involves a mechanic, man, I've been a mechanic for 26 years. Like there's stuff that I just automatically write in about the way machinery behaves and the way things usually go. You know, somebody who's not a mechanic may not think to write into their storytelling.
Yeah, and I noticed that too when we'll get into this about the changes, but when we were updating this story and with some of the short stories we've written in this world that are with the J.R. Handley Presents anthologies that Three Ravens published, is the way you can use tech issues that I would have never even known could be an issue to enhance the tension in a story in a way that doesn't require, just extra bullets and pew-pews just because they're cool. Which I would have never considered. Like for me, you want to add tension, you put more bad guys in front of you. And you are like, no. But what happens if your bird is in space and you can't breathe in space and it breaks? And then suddenly you've got a whole new level of tension that, like I said, it wouldn't even have occurred to me. Because, obviously I know that can happen, but I wouldn't know enough to fake it to make it believable. So all I know about space engines is that if you invert the dilithium crystals and reverse the polarity, you can fix just about anything.
Or if you fly around the sun fast enough, you can time travel.
Or through the sun, you can repower your engine.
That too.
Stargate Universe. All right. So to answer the question, since I'm interviewing myself at some level, so we can both talk about this book. Nick wanted to be here because he was originally going to interview both of us, but they had a big bust day. I don't know what we can talk about with that, so we'll leave it at that on his job. And so he had to do paperwork, so he couldn't be here. And having been through the military and death by PowerPoint, I do not envy anyone who has to do all that paperwork.
God, no, that's why I'm not an aircraft mechanic anymore, man. The paperwork sucks.
Right. So obviously I spent 8.5 years in the Army. I enlisted as a watercraft operator on a riverine squadron, which basically meant in Navy parlance, I was a bosun's mate. My dad did like 23 years as an engineman. So of course I got even and joined the Army as a bosun's mate. And then when I was going through the recruiting station, they said, well, you're in a unit that does direct combat service support for infantry units because it's a riverine squadron. If your boat breaks, you're infantry with them. Would you like to go to infantry basic at Fort Benning? And I'm like, that sounds cool. We get to play with guns and blow shit up. Sign me up. Because otherwise I would have gone to Fort Jackson with all the other transportation guys. So I went, I did OSUT. I got the one site unit training. I got the infantry MOS before I had any others, got my blue cord, the whole 9 yards. Then we go to the riverine unit that I was supposed to report to. And turns out the unit shut down in 1974. Someone forgot to tell the National Guard Recruiting Bureau. What happened was I found out later the unit identifier number that's in all of the paperwork purposes. When they converted this boat unit to a truck unit, they just used the same number. And so if you're not in the state, because I was enlisting in a different state's National Guard because I was traveling to go there for college, if you're not in the state, you might not realize that. So you just go with whatever the original document was. And so I get there and they say, well, you kind of have to learn to drive trucks. So they sent me right back to truck driver school. I did not drive trucks so well. You knock over a few porta potties and cover a sergeant major in blue goo. Oops. Suddenly they don't want you anymore. And I've told this story in my newsletter, so I won't belabor the point, but I ended up back in the infantry and spent 8 years in the light infantry. And I volunteered for the light infantry because I thought light infantry means we carried less. Boy, was I wrong. And I now know why everyone was laughing at me when I volunteered for that. Light infantry is light because you don't have heavy support of tanks and such. So that means you're the guys that walk everywhere and carry everything. If you see the pictures of the grunts with the backpack that's so big, they're doing the 45-degree lean, they're light infantry. The mech infantry or the heavy infantry, they get their vehicles to carry their rucksacks, which is cheating if you ask me, but nobody asked me. And so, yeah, I feel like because of that time and all of the various, I did the trucks, the boats, and the walking, I do feel like that affects the way I tell stories because I do factor in transportation issues, that your tactics definitely changed by the medium you're getting to the fight in. We fought differently as a squad moving on foot than we did as a, mounted convoy escort of gun trucks protecting a convoy than we would have as a riverine squadron on the river. Because obviously water acts differently than roads than your shoe leather, right? So I think that factors in. Having seen combat, one of the things I came away with is how often people write combat scenes, be it as police procedurals or whatever, where they go in, they do the thing, they kill the people, their friends die, and then rinse and repeat, and it never affects them. Unless the guy has severe amnesia where he resets every day, like 50 first dates, or he's a sociopath, that's just not how humans behave. Like, you don't do those things and it doesn't affect you. And that's one of the things I take away is the after effect of all of those actions, be it big or small, depending on the character. I do think that is one of the things I took away from my time in the Army. So,
well, and I think that definitely comes through with your storytelling too. Like for me to get that, like I had to listen to probably 10 or 15 different podcasts from where combat vets were guests on the podcast to even kind of get a taste of that sort of mindset. And you just automatically like know it. And it definitely shows up.
It's one of the things you learn the hard way. But I also realized in writing both this book and some of my others, the limitations of my knowledge, because obviously I know squad infantry tactics, but you asked me to write about artillery. I'm like, they pull the stick and it goes boom. I don't know. Right. I just call for fire support. I got to read a map and that's all I need to know. And you don't realize how much happens above your head as far as like, as a sergeant, I was a team leader. My fire team was large enough to be a squad just because the nature of the convoys. So I could reasonably talk about leading a squad. I did that. Like I led a rifle squad before I could legally drink in America. But asked me to be a platoon sergeant. Like I vaguely get the idea because I saw my platoon sergeant much past company level. And it's just all magic to me. Like, I don't know what they do. They sign papers in an office somewhere and that's it. It would never occur to me to think, okay, what's logistics doing? What are we doing with, all the other departments that are in a brigade with intel and all of that? Like right. Someone else worried about that. And so that's the humbling thing is to realize the limitations of your knowledge too. Which I'm sure you dealt with too, because like fixing an aircraft is a lot different than knowing how to drive a ship.
100%. And being able to manage aircraft maintenance is not the same thing as being able to be in charge of an entire aircraft squadron. Like my focus as an aircraft maintenance guy is up assets so that ops can plan and fly missions. Like that's my entire focus. What ops did on those missions, I don't know. I didn't fly. I'm not a pilot. I'm not a naval air crewman. Now I could, hang out with the pilots and the air crewmen and, drink beer and find out what they did, but it's not the same thing as doing it firsthand.
No, not at all. And so that's one of the things you learn is even if you serve, I still do my research on parts. And like everyone just assumes you're a gun expert because I was infantry. And like I could fire, I could hit the target. I was a squad designated marksman. I can drive a car. Don't ask me to explain how an internal combustion engine works. I don't know. I stick the key in and we go. And so it's one of the things you don't think about until you start factoring in like what I know. And then you realize, well, I know the thing does the thing, but how does it do the thing? I don't know. And so it's definitely like you realize you still do more research because like I know the basics of ballistics, but you want to talk about the various properties of the hundreds of thousands of rifle variants out there. I'm like, I could Google it just like you. I mean, I could find out the ballistics generally. I know, the difference of a 5.56 hitting something versus a 7.62.
Right.
But after that, I'm just guessing, just like everyone else, which is why I don't focus on those details and I go for rule of cool. That's why I don't.
That's why I prefer to write space opera versus science fiction. Rule of cool functions better.
Yeah, I don't do near future because I don't want to have to be limited by like nobody can tell me I got the ballistics wrong on a weapon I made up myself. Right? And so I do future. And the other thing I took away, even though I was federalized, so I spent time on active duty because of 9/11, I still was a federalized guardsman. So my entry into the military was the National Guard. So I proudly claimed nasty girl status. A lot of the units that even federalized that I worked with were National Guard units. So I've realized, and I learned this through writing for Galaxy's Edge, the Jason Anspach and Nick Cole. It's not as much fun for me to write the Spec Ops. Everybody wants to do it because it sounds cool, but in reality, like Spec Ops, they practice that to the point where they're well-oiled machines. They don't need to talk a lot. But that's kind of boring to read about. Like, I want the interpersonal dialogue. You want the Joker and the whatever characters, the misfits. And so I've realized my passion in writing The Reservist and The Reservist 2, which is who knows when that gets published. I prefer to write the everyman, the average guy that's just sort of sucked up off the street and welcome to the military, kid. There's a war on and you're going. And that resonates more with me. It's just the because it could be me in the story as I'm reading it. So
without a doubt, man, that's what I prefer to write too. Is more of the, I mean, the spec ops stuff is sexy, but that's a tiny sliver of the grand total of all human endeavor and warfare. Like spec ops is just tiny little bit. The rest of it is, it is the Mark I Mod 1 infantry guy with a rifle in his hand. Or if you're over on the Navy side of the house, just the average friggin' ordinary seaman, the average enlisted guy who shows up like it's a day job and just tries to get through the day without being bored to tears. Even though he or she is part of a well-oiled war machine that's putting warheads on foreheads, like it doesn't feel like that, even when that's what the mission is. Like it's just another day on the job. I mean, sure, the job is in a place where aircraft are landing at 180 knots, 6 inches from your feet, to your right. And if you step over the little dotted line, you're a dead man. But that's just your work environment. I mean, it's no different than working up on the highway, doing roadside assist. Like one side of the line, you're cool. The other side of the line, you're a fine red mist. It's just part of your environment. So you don't think about that stuff. Whereas
and one of the things that you brought to the table, I mean, obviously I was a historian by training. My master's degree was in colonial American history. So I know the concept that sailors were impressed into the military. It led to the War of 1812. Never occurred to me to put that in a sci-fi setting. And we were talking as we were taking the world that was existed and we kind of improved upon it. Because like I said, we'll get to the how the world came to be. Because of your Navy experience, you're like, well, we got to have the average equivalent of the average National Guardman. We're going to have sailors get shanghaied into the military. Right place, wrong time, and they wake up in a ship and you Navy or you die. And
welcome to the Navy, son.
I've seen that obviously because I read fantasy and I read historical fiction. I never thought, let's throw that into sci-fi. And you're like, why not? So
why not bring back rum, sodomy, and the lash? I mean, come on.
Right? It was good enough for Winston Churchill.
Good enough for us.
All right. So the next part of the military stuff. So do you draw on people you knew when you served in the Navy?
Yeah, to some degree. Obviously, I changed the names to protect the guilty. And I would borrow personality traits from both, guys or people that I enjoyed serving with and people that I hated serving with. I mean, they're all fodder for storytelling at this point in my life. And so I would make composites up. But a lot of the stuff with the maintenance crews in Ghostship, like I pulled that stuff straight out of, actual like stuff I watched happen or was stuck dealing with when I was an aircraft maintenance guy.
Yeah. And I one of the things we talked about is it's in a short story that's not out yet, but the idea that sometimes the higher ups want to work you overly hard because they've got quotas they want to meet. And your comfort and safety is less important than they're getting the bullet point on their officer evaluation or the medal they'll get if you break the time record. And so one of the things I learned as a gun truck operator is when you do your preventive maintenance checks and services, PMCS, you check the vehicle before you fly it. Navy's got a term for it for your aircraft, basically certifying that it's okay to go on mission. If you know what you're doing. Yeah, if you know what you're doing, you can sideline a vehicle. And so there were times where we're like, like we haven't slept in 3 days. We're just going to go to the base we like. And when we get there, suddenly we're sidelined on the base with a good chow and the MWR.
Like, funny how that works. Sorry.
And sometimes when that happens, your Blue Force tracker just isn't working anymore. That is the Blue Force tracker, and there were a few other versions of it, but it's basically a AOL instant messenger to the rear with a map overlay, essentially, is the easiest way to explain it. It had more features probably that I didn't use, but and we used that. And that, of course, was the people in the rear in Kuwait micromanaging us when we were in the firefights in Iraq, which is something we both talked about with this series, is the idea if you have instant comms, like how much could that make a bad situation worse? Because someone in the rear with their coffee and their safety is going to like, no, you need to do it this way.
Heck yeah. I mean, that's one of my favorite scenes in all of military filmdom is that scene from We Were Soldiers when the they got, a general on the radio trying to tell, Hal Moore that he's going to have to come, do X, Y, or Z. And he's like, hey, I'm in the middle of a fight right now. You come down here and talk to me, but otherwise, I'm busy.
Yeah, that's one of the funniest lines of that Sergeant Major when they greet him, the greeting of the day. Good morning, Sergeant Major. Who says
tell me what kind of damn day to
have? And then when they rescue that one young sergeant, it's in the book and the movie. When they rescue that one good young sergeant who's like covered in dead bodies and blood, and he barely survived this, almost complete mission wipe. The Sergeant Major looks down at him and says, "Now it's a good morning, son."
Yeah.
Like, the hard part, or not the hard part, the crazy part is that character, he was real.
Oh, Sergeant Major Plumley? Yeah, he was the real deal.
He's like certified crazy. Not crazy in a bad way, but like, I wouldn't want to make him mad.
No, he was just one of those, tougher than freaking nails, tougher than woodpecker lips, old school soldiers that had, been through World War II, Korea, and, then, the friggin' Idrang in Vietnam. Like, he's just one of those dudes.
When I was in college, the Hal Moore and the reporter that wrote the book came to our college and spoke to the English department. And I talked to him about that, and I asked him about the Sergeant Major, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that was him in a nutshell. That dude was certifiable." Like, he said that the scene in the movie, which is also in the book, where the reporter asks the Sergeant Major if he's going to grab a rifle, and his answer, because he only had the pistol at his hip, and he said, "If it comes to the point where I need one, there'll be plenty of them lying around."
Yeah.
I could relate to that. That was such a perfect answer.
Well, heck, and hell, Sergeant Major Plumley was at least a third of the inspiration for the attitude for friggin' Sergeant the platoon sergeant Philippos.
Yeah. So all right. So obviously I draw from people I knew in the military. Most of my friends that I served with, I'm the last one from my fire team left alive. So I'm not using their names specifically because their families asked for me to respect their privacy, and I'll honor that till the day I die. But I kind of use their personality traits. Some of it's a composite. Some of it's literally a cut and paste with a new last name. And I use some of the stereotypes that exist because they exist for a reason. Every unit's got that guy obsessed with knives, the guy that thinks he's smart because he went to college, but he enlisted, the guy that didn't go to school and he's a barracks lawyer and he's convinced he knows the UCMJ better than the JAG teams.
Right.
And somehow he still ends up in trouble because he can't beat the JAG teams in court. I don't know how that works. Although, admittedly, you don't see that as much because second chances in the military aren't really a thing. They just boot you anymore. Like the idea where you could, yo-yo up and down the rank structure as an enlisted man, I don't think that really happens anymore.
No, it was starting to not happen. 09, 2010-ish. Like, that was kind of already a thing of the past. Like, when I came in the Navy, man, there were chief petty officers retiring with red stripes, which means they didn't have 12 years of consecutive good conduct. And so there was guys retiring with, 24 years with 24 years with red stripes. And it was kind of the running joke that in order to make chief petty officer, you had to have gone to captain's mast at least once. The Navy reformed their image as, over the time that I was an active duty guy. Like, I went to NJP a couple of times myself, but
I liked being a corporal so much I did it 3 times.
Yep, I was so darn good at taking tests. I made petty officer second class twice. First time, both times.
So for me, the first one, I was celebrating my promotion and I went drinking. I was not 21, and you puke on one general's shoes and they get their panties in wide. I'm just saying it could happen to anybody.
Yeah, it could have happened to anybody, man.
And then I did well. I sobered up because they make you go to the alcohol classes, and I did good. So they promoted me again because I was competent. And, they'll put up with a lot for you if you can pass a PT test and you're competent at your job.
If you're good at your job, they'll put up with a lot of crap.
And so the second time I celebrated again, and the next morning I woke up and was told, "You're a specialist." Because that time they didn't want to remove me from the position. They just removed the stripes. And I minded my manners. I straightened up my behavior. And I made corporal again. And they didn't want me to mess up because they were nice. So they promoted me to sergeant. So I couldn't get demoted from corporal again.
Yep, I had a senior first class petty officer pull me aside after my second experience with NJP. because I was bitching about the evals. I wasn't getting good evals, even though I was a really good mechanic. He was like, "Hey man, you know what your problem is?" I'm like, "No, what?" He's like, "You don't play the game. Everybody plays the game. You just suck at it. Like maybe you should start playing the game. You know, shine your shoes, press your uniform, act like you're in the military." And I was like, "Oh, Roger that." And after I did that, things turned around for me.
I had a lieutenant when I was going through boot camp, was a West Point guy or a platoon leader. We met him like once because the officers at boot camp, I'm sure they're there somewhere. I don't know what they're doing, but I know they exist because they're on the TO&E, table of organizational equipment, so your rank structure. But I met him once, and I got in a little bit of trouble at boot camp because I had anger issues. I got into it with one of the other trainees when I was at Fort Benning. They jokingly refer to John Wayne School for Wayward Boys, or right. Boys and girls now because it's co-ed. And the LT pulled me aside and he was like, "Private Handley, the trick is cooperate and graduate. That's the secret. Just play the game." And I used that throughout the rest of my career because that's the magic bullet. You got to play the game. If you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit.
Yep, play the game and then develop the I believe button. So at some point, they're going to shovel you a line of crap, and you can either be mad about it or you can hit the I believe button and get on with your day.
And sometimes you just have to ignore logic, because I remember when they were teaching us about bayonet, and they teach you bayonet charges and the bayonet drills because it's the esprit de corps, the spirit of the warrior, and all that. It's where you see in the movies what makes the grass grow. Blood makes the grass grow. As you're stabbing rubber dummies. And we were telling us how this bayonet was going to save our life someday if we ever ran out of bullets in a firefight. And I was the idiot that raised my hand and asked the drill sergeant, "Why do we assume just because we're out of bullets that the bad guys are too?" And his answer, of course, was half right, face, front, in rest position, go. So I did a lot of push-ups. I lost so much weight at boot camp because of that. I had to learn the hard way, obviously, that my mom did not recognize me at graduation. She literally narrowed it down to platoon and looked for white guys in the right squad.
Yeah.
That is how she recognized me.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it also helped that I gained 3 inches at boot camp. Supply also hated me. I had a growth spurt at 18. I was thankful. 5'6" is a hard height to be as a dude. Like 5'9" I can handle. 5'6" dating becomes a little more difficult. I'll take those inches.
Yeah, I went to boot camp at 150 pounds, soaking wet, and I came out at 180 because I was a slow learner. I spent a lot of time on my face, and the company commander put me on double, like everything for food because I was skinny as a hostage.
So I had the exact opposite problem. I was too fat to enlist. The guy that was the doctor at the MEP station, I was there on literally his last day before he retired, and he deployed to World War II with my grandfather, which I didn't know at the time, but I guess I looked enough like him. He was like, "Oh, whatever." And so he just fudged the numbers, and I didn't know. I don't know if I'd have said anything. And then I get to boot camp, and of course they do the at least in the Army, while you're in the reception battalion, the adjutant general battalion that you're in, where they do your paperwork, process you into the Navy into the Army. In my case, your case would have been the Navy, where they process all the paperwork before you meet your drill sergeants.
Yeah. We had this similar thing at the recruit depot in San Diego.
Okay, so when we do that, they do a PT test there, and you have to do like a ridiculously low number of sit-ups in a mile run pace, where if you can jog it, you can pass it. But I passed it, so they didn't have a reason to send me home other than that I didn't make weight. The drill sergeants decided I was their project, so they were on me like white on rice when it came to the shark attack. And then after that, I became the project. So we have what we call road guards at boot camp, where like you're the one who runs in front to stop traffic, and I was the rear road guard. So when we'd get about halfway, I had to sprint up the line and relieve them. And then when they had suitably passed, then I sprint to get my position in the rear, which is also how I lost so much weight. And yeah, my drill sergeants actually went through because I didn't learn like how to eat properly. We did a lot of fast food because I was busy with scouts and all the sports and stuff. And so when I went through boot camp, my drill sergeants would walk me through the line, eat this, not that. And they were teaching me basic nutrition. Yeah. And when everyone else was rush in, rush out, I was like, "No, Private Handley, you were not leaving until you finish everything on that plate." So I learned a lot. The cool thing was because I pushed so hard, they were so impressed that when I failed my final PT test, they let me, everyone gets to retake it. But my drill sergeant ran behind me on the run because I missed the run by 3 seconds with a rubber ducky, which is basically literally an M16, but it's all made of rubber. It's a training one. and he ran behind me with a rubber ducky. And every time I slowed down, I got a butt stroke to the kidneys.
Oh,
and that hurts if you don't know,
yeah.
dear listener.
That stings.
It does. And so I didn't slow down a lot because I didn't want to get, you only have to hit me twice. And so I actually passed it with 15 seconds to spare. And they didn't do that kind of stuff for everyone. I will say in the military, if you work hard and you try, even if you fail, they bend over backwards because it's the effort that matters.
Yeah, they would. I learned as a mid-grade NCO, right? Like petty officer second class, petty officer first class. I would much rather have to friggin' educate a doer than try to motivate a thinker. Man, I'll take that guy that's just willing to try, even though he doesn't know what the hell's going on, over that dude that thinks he knows everything every time.
For me, when I was a sergeant, I preferred the stubborn ones over the smart-ass ones because you can weaponize stubbornness. You can do that any day of the week. I learned to do that myself. But if you've got someone who just thinks they're hot shit and they don't have to work for it, that's the expression a lot of sports coaches told us growing up. What was it? Natural ability meets hard work, or hard work beats natural ability when natural ability doesn't work hard.
Yeah, hard work beats talent when talent won't work harder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, if hard work and talent go together, you're screwed. But yeah, I learned that the hard way because it wasn't that I was smarter than anybody else or I was better at sports than I was just willing to work harder. And that's like been my superpower. Too stubborn to quit, even when I should have.
Yeah, like I can't control how much talent I do or do not have. I can't control the opportunities that do or don't come my way. The only thing I can control is how hard I work, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be outworked by anybody.
Exactly. So one of the things that we've talked about, obviously, how our military experience, and we kind of went far afield, but it's cool. I think the listeners will love the stories. When you were, obviously, your time in the military affects the way you tell stories. Has it changed since you got out, how you engage with content? Do you read books differently, watch movies differently, all that kind of stuff?
It's hard to say because I was a voracious reader before I made it to the military. And then while I was in, that didn't change. Like my taste in content changed as I aged and matured. Like, for example, I very much loved Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time back when I was like 18, 19 years old. Recently, I decided to go back and reread it since it's completed, thanks to Brandon Sanderson. And I started reading it. And after like book 2, I was just like, oh man, it's just not for me. It's not that it's bad. Like, I think it's still very good writing. It's just not my cup of tea anymore. And so I think what happened is over the years, my experience changed my taste in story, in consuming stories, which of course certainly changed my taste in telling stories too, I think.
I think for me, my tolerance of the military stuff, like tactically, like when I see things, like if you see the shows where the E1 is telling off the colonel, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't happen. And if it does, the senior NCO is going to pull that guy behind a woodshed and give him some wall-to-wall counseling, as we called it back in the day. Like if the bad stuff happens, there's consequences that you don't see because, of course the E1 knows more than everyone. Like the Wesley Crusher effect. That never would have happened. His supervisor would have been smacking him around like a rag doll.
Yeah, he'd have been busy friggin' scooping dirt out of pad eyes or oiling tie-down chains or some other stupid, meaningless task.
And so that I think that the culture overall, the ambiance is what sells it for me. Like, you have to have like the rank structure. Even you could call it whatever you want. Like, it doesn't matter, blue unicorn, red unicorn, pink unicorn, or your NCOs. They still have to act like, small unit leaders, right? Like you can call it what you want, throw in whatever alien words you want. The basics of the job is still the same, right? And so I think that kind of stuff matters for culture. The way people react to stress, unless you're like throwing in aliens or magic, is going to generally be the same. And like I said, I know sometimes people mouth off. When I was the Sergeant Major of the Army's USO tour in 2005, or maybe it was 2004, it was Christmas, I think. It was while I was in Iraq the second time. So I was there November 2004 to December 2005. So it was in that window. The Sergeant Major of the Army came and he was talking, and the guys in front of me, like, it was in the beginning, so it would have been December 2004. I was waiting to get a picture with him because, of course, I literally just had my sergeant stripes officially pinned on, and I wanted to get a picture standing at Parade West with the Sergeant Major of the Army. And I did, but the guy in front of me went up and he started telling off. He was a guardsman who got from Tennessee. Sorry, Tennessee. He got deployed and he didn't like it. He signed up for the college money. He wasn't supposed to have to go to war. And so he's telling off the sergeant major. He didn't sign up for this, and they need to send him home now. And he was using some 4-letter words. Good old boy that thought he was the toughest mofo on the block. And the sergeant major just smiled and nodded. He's like, we don't want people here that don't want to be here. So if you just go to my aide, it was probably a young sergeant, you just tell him your unit number and social security number, and we'll get you squared away. And of course, he leaves happy. And I looked at the sergeant major. I'm like, they're getting to go home? He's like, if by home you mean the brig, absolutely. And I said, then what happens? He said, there are 4 restarts on day 1, and they're still going to stay in country.
Yeah. Yeah, that dude just bought himself a one-way ticket to Discipline Town.
Yeah, and he said, from what the sergeant major told me, and obviously I didn't follow the case because I left after this, but he was like, yeah, they're going to go to the brig in Kuwait. They're going to stay there for whatever their sentence is on 0 days. And then when they leave and they get reassigned a new unit, they're going to start at day 1 as an E1 of their, 12-month tour. And that's a hell of a pay drop from E4, which is what they were. Like, and while they're in the brig, I don't think they get hazard pay either. Like, I just think it's 0, right?
I don't know what the heck that dude was thinking, man, because as an E4, you couldn't have paid me to talk to my command master chief, let alone the master chief petty officer of the Navy. Like, there's no way.
So there's a Marine, Tyler J. Satfield, who publishes as Tyler J. He wrote the EAS song, was kind of contemporary to my time in the service. He was a Marine. The EAS song, estimated separation date is, I don't know exactly what the EAS stands for because it's a Marine acronym, but basically when you're getting out.
End of active service.
Yeah, and so one of the lines in there he talked about that resonated with me to this day is, I'd rather run over an IED than ever have the BC talk to me, which is BC Brigade Commander. Like, I avoided officers like the plague. If you were above company grade officer, I didn't want you to know I existed.
Yeah.
Because generally, you're either doing really well and, that's top percent, and I knew I wasn't me, or you're in trouble. All right. So I'm a ghost. You don't know me. Gray man here. So, yeah, but the reason I mentioned that story is, yes, people do dumb things. You got young hormonal people that think they're, God's gift to the world, but there are consequences when that happens. And it's not, oh, you're right, Private Smith. Like, it's no, you don't talk to an officer that way, and we're going to beat it into you.
Gosh, I've seen the light. My bad. No. Absolutely
so, yeah,
not.
I think for me, it's the ambiance. The guns, like, they have to behave like if you get the fire discipline wrong. If it's a plot point, I'll buy it. But, the iconic pictures you see where people have their fingers on the trigger. No. You don't put your finger in the trigger well until you're ready to shoot something. And you don't flag your buddies, which means you don't point your rifle barrel in their direction. Because, negligent discharges happen, which is when you fire the bullets you didn't mean to fire. And if you do that pointing at your friend, you don't have a friend anymore. So
yeah, friendly fire isn't.
Right. And so for me, like the little, it's more ambiance and vibes than anything. So, all right. Well, we got distracted because we had fun talking about the military stuff. And this is why we're dangerous together, because we had a 15-minute meeting before we published this book at the local coffee shop where we're just going to go over some logistics. And 3 hours later, you're like, my boss kind of wants me to get back to work and finish my job. Because we just got to talk. So I'm going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly shill for the man, and then we're going to get back to talking about the book. Boom.
Across 1,000 battlefields and 1,000,000 wars, there is always a question. What do you do when all the chips are on the table? Do you run? Try to find salvation in the arms of an easy peace? Or do you stand and fight and send your enemies into whatever hole they crawled out of? On Deadly Ground, a heroic Last Stand anthology, has 10 stories addressing that question. Each character faces the impossible in different ways, but all will be tested before the day is done. Can they earn a heroic victory amongst the endless eternity of space, or are they doomed to fall into obscurity?
All right, thank you for sticking with that commercial interlude. The next part of the introduction, interview that we normally do with authors that have kind of a diverse set of stories out there as we talk about what we've written. So obviously I've written the Sleeping Legion series and Tim Taylor's Human Legion universe. I've written The Reservist in the Galaxy's Edge universe. It's currently a standalone, sort of their Medal of Honor series. I have a bunch of books in the pipeline. I've written some standalone sci-fi horror, which is a lot harder to write than you think, to keep the tension going. I've written a mature comedy, USS Adventures of the USS Big Stick, or Vacuum Sucks Hard is the official title, and a bunch of short stories because I'm passionate about short stories. That's how I came into reading. Reader's Digest with a lot of condensed stories, and that's where I developed my passion for stories. And so I try to pay it forward with short content. And I know there's no money in it. For me, it's a passion project. When I break even, I call it a day. So that's what I've kind of known for. And they've got 2 new series in the works that'll be coming out in addition to this universe that I'm writing with you. But what about you? Aside from this universe, what have you written?
I've written one other novel. It's set in the Car Wars universe. It's titled 72 Hours to Graceland. It's part of the Dead Man's Run, cross-country road rally race, like Cannonball Run meets Death Race kind of thing, that's licensed through Steve Jackson Games. I've written, a smattering of short stories here and there. A couple of them in the Dagden Federation universe, one in Hillbilly's JTF 13 universe, which is, like a supernatural monsters are real. The military has a unit to fight them kind of setup. I've got some short content in the Car Wars universe. And some stuff with John Holmes over at Canon Publishing in the Fallen Empire universe.
Okay. So just as a quick correction, because this will matter later because you and I have big plans. We call it Dagda Federation because that's what this group falls under. And basically the Dagda Federation is at a certain point in time, we develop FTL and that changes the dynamic. And you end up with a intergalactic federation, essentially, of the powerhouses. It's a federation because basically all the global powers that are global powers now sort of form together, and the little nations that don't have FTL kind of have to go with the program or get starved out. And so that's the Dagda Federation. But at a certain point in time, the Dagda Federation will fall and we'll tell stories outside of that, or at least parts of it will break away. So we called it, I think you and I agreed, was the Galactic Legion is the broader universe.
Yeah, you're right.
Dagda Federation is this series. And then more specifically, this set of books is the Ghostship series, which is so let's talk about the starting of this universe. And while we talk about it, I'm going to throw that lovely cover up just because 3 Ravens did an amazing job. Oh, it would help if I have the right thing up. 3 Ravens did an amazing job on this cover. And I think it was JF Posthumous that did the cover for them, right?
Yep.
And so while I get that up, there we go. I thought I had it up already and I accidentally closed it instead. That's what happens when you hit the wrong button. All right, so this is the cover, but basically I wrote this story originally. It was the first novel I published and it was called Breach Team. And it was the story of what's book 1 and then what will become book 2. But the pacing was off. It was almost all straight up and then crash at the end. So the pacing didn't work. There was too much army in my Navy, or too much army in the Navy. And the Marines didn't have quite enough of a Marine feel, although technically they're not Marines, they're Legion. And then I had co-written it officially with Chris Winder. But at a certain point in time, we realized our taste diverged. He wanted to write more pulp, and I wanted to try to write more stories that you could read multiple times and get different things out of it, which both are valid ways to tell story. I read both. But if I don't write fast, I want something that leaves a lasting impression, right? And so when we split up, are the properties we were co-writing, because I'd rather break the business while we're still friends than have a big fight later kind of thing.
Right.
And I'm still friends with Chris to this day. At that point in time, I had done all of the writing on the Breach Team universe and designed the world. And he was basically my tech advisor because he's brilliant. He was an IT guy. And then he had written, we had co-written, it was my base premise, but he had done all of the writing for what became the Cyborg Core. The old joke is this, because it's a good book. I recommend you read them. Jay and Chaney put them out through his Variant Press. The old joke is the VA is where patriotism goes to die. So the premise for that book was what happens if you go in for surgery and they basically turn you into a cyborg and steal your body from you. Think RoboCop the vibes. And then he wakes up when he regains sentience, and it's thousands of years in the future. So when we split up, I was like, well, you've done most of the writing on this book. You keep it. It's yours. I did the writing on this book. I keep it. It's mine. I unpublished it because I was at some point in time going to edit it. And Hillbilly had actually read the first version, and he's the one he pointed out all the flaws I just mentioned. He said the bones are good, but it needs help. And he's like, and you definitely need someone who knows the Navy. I've got this guy that just wrote a Car Wars book for me, David Hensley. I think you two will get along. You have a lot in common. And so you and I talked, and then it was like, shit, let's do this. And then when we started talking and we realized because obviously Dave, you read the book as it was, and you got the synopsis evaluation that Hillbilly put out, as having done a lot of slush pile reading on his own. We'll come back to the cover, but that way they can see you. And you said, yeah, we agree that these are the problems. So how do we fix it? And at a certain point in time, you and I decided, well, in order to fix it, we have to split the two events into two different books. So they find a ghost ship. That's the name of this one. That's Derelict. And then something else, which is book 2, which we won't spoil. All of that was in one really long book. Like it was Brandon Sanderson levels of long. And then you changed it. And in making the Navy more Navy, like I think 75% of the book changed so completely that if you read it, you would get, if you read Breach Team and you read this, you'd get deja vu feelings, I think, but it wouldn't feel like you're reading the same novel at all.
No, for sure. Because in order to add in the Navy stuff, man, we had to add a sizable
Whole characters.
We had to add a sizable cast of characters to bring off the Navy stuff aside from the bridge team.
And you thought of things on the bridge team that I didn't even occur to me to throw in there. I'm like, boat driver, captain, weapons, we're good, right? And you were like, no, Jared, no, that's not good.
Well, and full disclosure, I'm an aviation guy, right? I don't belong. I've been on the bridge of a warship twice. Both times I was taking tours. I've never been on the bridge while the ship was in operation. However, I have a very good friend of mine who was a fire controlman for a while and then went over to bosun's mate, who stood bridge watches, steered the ship, was a bosun's mate of the watch. Like that dude straight up, I was just like, hey man, what's it like to be on the bridge? And we just shot the breeze for a little while. And that heavily informed how I wrote the bridge scenes.
We really need to give him like a cameo appearance or something in this book if we didn't already. I know you did some of your Navy friends.
Oh no, bosun's mate of the watch. Where's he at? Yeah, bosun's mate, Chief Petty Officer Bo Smith.
Yeah,
that's the guy.
Oh, cool. Well then, great minds think alike. You already did it.
Yeah, I just Tuckerized him.
Awesome. And so when we tell you that this series isn't done, I will say book 1 is obviously out because our publishing schedules and commitments. This is something we're taking the time to get right, so it's not going to rapid release. You were not a fast writer either, and that's okay. No. We're okay that we probably aren't going to make millions off this book until the series is farther in. Book 2 is, I would say 50% done just by virtue of the words are there. You're going to have to layer the hell out of it and fix the same mistakes you fixed in book 1.
Yeah. Well, and then knock-on effects of stuff that we changed in book 1 or added to book 1 that was never there to begin with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you added some political intrigue that I hadn't even bothered. I threw in a commissar position just because it was I wanted to show that the Dagda Federation is top-heavy bureaucratic nightmare. They are not a communist nation. They have essentially what is it, the J12? Is it J12? That's the NATO group, the top 10 or 12, G12 or whatever. That's the basic.
Yeah, they got a ruling council of, there's a 5-member ruling council for the entire federation.
Right, and those councils are the nations that are essentially running NATO now. We speculated in our world building some changes and mergers and whatnot. But anyway, so we had the deputy commissar, not because we're trying to say this is the USSR in space. I've done that in other books. It can be fun to do. More to show it's just bureaucratic hellhole, and it gets in the way of good tactical decision making. And you changed all of that. I had the position as a throwaway, and you just weren't supposed to like him. And you added so much intrigue. I'd like to go more in depth in that intrigue, but it would be a spoiler. But I really loved what you did. In my head, I was just going to find a convenient way to airlock him and move on. And you're like, no, this character is too cool to use or not to use. And
yeah, the guy just kind of sometimes, I don't know how this works for you, but sometimes as I'm writing and I come across what ought to be a throwaway character, sometimes that dude just refuses to be a throwaway character, man. That dude just jumps up and does stuff that goes on the page, and I'm like, hey there, all right. I mean, this guy, Deputy Commissar, Mortensen, Javier Mortensen. That dude sounds like Londo Mollari from Babylon 5 in my head. And I've had, arguments with Deputy Commissar Mortensen about the career of Captain Kaufman.
And the captain, I thought, when I originally wrote her, she was just like a stand-in for Jane, Captain Jane from Voyager.
Oh, yeah.
I do not. I mean, that the bones are there, I guess, in that she's female and she's a captain. But you did so much more with it. I think making that comparison at this point wouldn't even be fair. Because I was so focused on the grunts that I didn't even like the Navy was sort of just there to fluff the combat scenes along.
Yeah, I think that it's still an apt comparison, but it's probably kind of like comparing a drawing of an apple to an apple tree. Like there's just a lot more there now because I've served with a bunch of different Navy officers that kind of became a composite for Captain Kaufman.
Yeah. And so we'll throw that cover up one more time. So this is the cover as far as our involvement, because we always talk about this. We basically gave each of the first three books, because we've outlined the first three. We know where the future ones are going to go, but not so much. I mean, there's still room. So book one, the outline was bullet by bullet. Book two, the outline is bullet by bullet. Book three is chapter by chapter bullets as opposed to scene by scene. Book 4 through whatever is literally just, this is what's going to happen in less than a paragraph. So obviously we didn't get covers made, but for the first three, you and I said, hey, what would be cool on there? Like, what's the essence of this story? And then we gave it to Jenny and David, William Joseph Roberts of the Hillbilly over at Three Ravens, and they gave us back this cover. And I absolutely love it. And then if we zoom in, like when we first did the cover, we worked with a different cover designer who's not in the business anymore. And we came up with this logo for the Dagda Federation because the name Dagda comes from Celtic roots. And so you've got the little Celtic symbol with the sword through it. And we originally, it was on the pauldron of the breach team armor. The guy was wearing more Halo type armor in that image. And it was on the pauldron, the shoulder of the armor. And we thought it was so cool, we wanted to use it. So Jenny was like, well, why don't we make it the O? And it's just...
Yeah, that was such a nice touch.
It was. And so I really liked what she was doing. It captures the essence. I mean, their armor doesn't really look like this, but it captures the essence of what was going on. They're not in like Halo Master Chief armor. It's a lot more lightweight. I mean, it's still airtight, but, more Running Man, less Halo.
Yeah. Well, and something I was told kind of early into this whole writing gig for me was, hey, man, the cover doesn't necessarily have to match anything happening in the book. It just needs to get the reader to look at it long enough to be like, hey, that looks cool, and then read the back. I was like, really?
For most people, if the cover matches the book, the author changed the book to match the cover because the image spoke to them, not the other way around, because it's very hard. And you get the best work from an artist if you say, this is the general idea, do your thing. You're the expert in this part of it. I find that does better for me than if I try to micromanage down to the nth degree. I mean, they'll give me what I asked for, but it's not as good as it could have been. And so,
like with Jenny, I put together a PowerPoint with like pictures that I clipped off the internet and put in a PowerPoint. It was like, hey, what do you think about this? And she took that pile of crap that I gave her and turned out a beautiful cover. So.
Yes, Jenny does hers through photo manipulation. So you think deposit stock photos, and then she merges them into one cool, really, really cool image, which I dig. I think it worked for this because it's captured the sort of genesis. So when we started writing this, before I started writing the Sleeping Legion series, which is my very first published work, I had the idea of the American Revolution in space. Obviously, my degree was in colonial American history. It made sense to me, like, what would that look like in space? Because space is a good analog to the way travel was back then. You have the regimental system because they're independent entities, often far removed from reinforcements and resupply, which is why the British had the regimental system. And I wanted to know what that would look like. And I wrote the first couple chapters, and it started with some cadets at a military school, and was going to take them to the war breaks out for New Carthage to declare its independence and the revolution. And I sent that to Tim Taylor, and he gave me a bunch of edits on writing style. It's too heavy-handed on the prose. And then I got the contract for Sleeping Legion, and this sat fallow. And then when Winder and I came back and started building the universe, because I had done the world building from a calendar perspective. This is the evolution to get us to the start of the story. I'm proud to say I predicted Brexit down to the month, but not the day. Because the writing was on the wall. They told the British they couldn't use British territorial waters. British has been a sea power for its entirety. You knew that was going to end badly from the beginning. Yeah. Anybody with common sense. It was a matter of time. I got lucky on the win, but it was inevitable that it was going to happen. And Winder gave me the throwaway line of, well, how do you have the American Revolution in space without the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War? So that's where Derelict comes in. Originally it was going to be, they find this derelict ship. It's, alien in that they don't recognize it. In the world building, before there was FTL, there are generational ships that took off. Some of them got lost. They don't know what happened to them. Others, when the when the generational ships showed up after the FTL had already gotten there, because the FTL obviously went quicker. And, so we know what happened to some of them in our world building. So some of those that disappeared, obviously you're going to have divergent cultures from when they left to cultural drift. And so that would appear alien to humans from Earth or the following world. So we started thinking, well, if they have this new tech that's going to be focused on different tech trees, what does that look like if you outfit this unit that now can go fight the big bad, right? Like, the equivalent of if the French had showed up sooner with all of their fancy, military grade weapons to completely outfit the military, so they weren't scrounging. That would have been a game changer in the beginning. So this was the idea to do that. And then, it ends there in book 1. And you got the idea of, well, what happens if they don't make it home on this ship right away? And the adventure is the journey. And we went from like straight mill sci-fi to like a lot of, I think, horror elements undertone. I wouldn't call it a horror novel, I don't think, but it's definitely
certainly has elements of horror built into it.
And so I think just by your working with it, it changed it so much. It just in that alone, because the Ghostship series is obviously they find a ghost ship, and it's going to be about them trying to make it home, a la BSG, Voyager, whatever. Like they're stuck on this ship and they've got to figure out the ship. Oh, Stargate Universe too. They got to figure out the ship, figure out how to control it, figure out how not to run out of supplies, and then, oh, by the way, now let's figure out how to get home because we don't know where we are yet.
Right.
Because in our world, the galaxy is huge, so obviously not all of it has been mapped. They are limited on FTL paths because if you're going to go FTL, you kind of have to know that when you get to places, there's nothing in your way. So you end up with, by default, kind of galactic highways, because otherwise you could sort of appear in a star, and that would be bad.
Yeah, the old Han Solo line.
Right. And so, like, that's kind of where it started. And so the idea that they've got to figure out, because we don't know where we are now, how do we get home, is the overall series plan. And then what happens when they get home at this point? Like, I know what we originally planned. Whether that's actually what happens, who knows? There's too much left in the air. But we did like playing with the idea of what does it mean to be human and alien, because like we have, some of the people that were on the FTL ships were transhumanists. So the generational ships that you and I, we wrote that in one of the short stories. So they were like doing body modifications. You have others that, the planet they are on, like if you saw, what was that, the Belters in that sci-fi?
The Expanse.
The Expanse, yeah. Like, terrain, if the gravity is different, humans are going to evolve and change over time. And so that we get to grapple with the question is, what is a just war? What does it really mean to be human? Because in some instances, like the bad guys are only bad because they're standing in front of us, not necessarily because they're bad people.
Yeah, not because they're bad from a moral standpoint, merely bad from a philosophical opposition standpoint.
And some of those are draftees and recruits that didn't have a choice. And so they're just kind of cannon fodder and didn't get much of a choice, just like you, which is why that old military cadence, if I die on the Chinese front, bury me with a Chinese grunt. The idea is, as a soldier or a sailor, you have more in common with the military of the other side than often you do with your civilian counterparts back home. And we really wanted to tap into that. Of course, we do have in one of the short stories, the big bad that are cannibals. Because
that's
You did it in Car Wars, and you're like, I wonder what cannibals look like in this setting. And we wrote a short story with just that premise: is what do cannibals look like in this setting? And then we're like, hey, now they could be a bad guy in a future series that eventually we'll write.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The idea of cultural cannibalism and persisting is strangely fascinating to me, and I can't really answer the question as to why. I just find it interesting. I think it's because it's such a bizarre thing. Like, it's so taboo that, like, I can understand it if you're, trapped on the top of a friggin' mountain somewhere and you got to eat your dead buddy so you don't starve to death. Like I can kind of understand that, but for it to exist as a cultural artifact to the point where, it's an artifact of who is us versus who isn't us, and people that are not us aren't really people, so we can eat them. Like,
yeah,
that is really interesting to me from a storytelling standpoint.
And it ties back in a couple of years ago, and I wish I could find the article I saw at the time, but the College of Cardinals of the Catholic Church even had that discussion. If we go to space and we find other living creatures, how do we determine if they're sentient and thus God's creatures and they're our brothers in Christ, or whatever your religion is, or they're a space cow and we can eat them?
Right.
And that's a fascinating thing to think about when you start looking at alien life.
Yeah, it is. Like,
and then, of course,
fun.
The other part of that is, but that also means if we can eat them, there are probably creatures out there that see us as cows in their next meal, right? And so it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting concept to play with. And that's one of the things you and I had fun with, is not that we wrote a story to tell big concepts, but just because we think about them, they factored into our storytelling in a way that added layers and depth.
Well,
and I've read the story in the editing process. I read the story several times, and I still noticed different things that stuck out at me based on what was going on in my life each time I read through it, that it didn't change. It wasn't like we edited it in. It was just the layers that are there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from our military experience, right? Like, as a military member, whether you're, pick your branch, one of the things that you're going to think about, especially in wartime, is the thing that makes somebody culturally us versus culturally a them, and why it's acceptable to wage war on them, in defense of us. Like that, I don't know, maybe like that's just baked into being a military member at some degree. Now, obviously, there are plenty of guys that I was in the service with that don't think about that. Like, the only thought in their mind is, where am I going to go get drunk at when we hit port? But we had plenty of conversations, at 2:00 in the morning, scrubbing aircraft about that kind of stuff, because there's really not much else to do when you're on the flight deck at 2 a.m. washing aircraft.
Yeah. And I do think like those kind of discussions, just because you think about them, it inadvertently layers in, because soldiers, I mean, if you've got time on your hands, like you start thinking about those questions and you start questioning, like, are we doing the right thing when we're fighting these people, whoever those people are, for your war? And so it's an interesting thing to throw into a story in ways that most civilians never have to grapple with. Like, am I a bad guy if I shot this person? I mean, he was trying to kill me, but was he a bad guy? Maybe not. I mean, he had a family at home too, right? So that
always brings me around to the Zangief line from Wreck-It Ralph. Just because I am bad guy does not make me bad guy.
Absolutely. So I think those ideas play in. So now let's talk about the characters. Well, first off, the setting. Obviously, for the weapons, we used a mix of ballistic and plasma, because obviously what you would want to use on ship versus what you would want to use in the atmosphere are going to be different, because you don't want to poke holes in your ship. That's bad. So from a tech perspective, obviously they have FTL, they've got spaceships, no real shielding technology from Dogda's side. They have enough of a screen that obviously micrometeorites aren't going to destroy them. Mostly we did that with you and I through a hardened hull that was extra hardened with special space chemicals, as opposed to like Star Wars warp shielding or whatever.
Right. Well, I don't think that we got too deep in the weeds on that anyway. We did it like we've gotten into the weeds on that a little bit, just from a storytelling Bible standpoint, so that we know where to go with it if it becomes a question down the road. But
well, I I think it affects ways that you don't think about, because what your weapon is determines what your tactics are.
Oh, sure. Like, and also like for this story, especially like their initial mission is a rescue mission. Like it's a derelict cargo hauler that's, dagged and flagged vessel. And their job is to, board it and figure out what the hell's going on, because it's a vessel in distress. You don't really want to blow holes in the hull of a ship you're trying to rescue. I mean, it kills civilians. That's bad.
Well, that draws back to one of the things that we played with is obviously there are international laws of the sea, right, that apply to salvage. It applies to requirements to render aid. It affects rules of war. And so we played into that because we had, and this is in the first 2 chapters, we had them rendering aid to this ghost ship, which has been missing for 20 years. But obviously, just because the ship is reported missing doesn't mean it is, right? Like, I mean, stolen cars don't cease to exist just because they're stolen. They're there somewhere, unless they're in a chop shop and broken into parts. But so we played with that, and the deputy commissar was like, that's a old law. We don't have to follow that. We have to do this mission that was the MacGuffin to get them there, which is, a ship went missing with a VIP's son on it. Obviously, we have to, or I don't know if we said son or daughter or what, but we have to look for it because this person is super important. And so if you're stopping that mission to render aid to this ghost ship, like, what does that look like? And so we played with the idea of morality and whether that changes just because we're at sea, which I thought was kind of cool, or just because we're at space instead of sea.
Yeah. Yeah. The law of the void.
What would change in a space society versus, what happens on Earth in a wet Navy. You and I have had lots of disagreements on whether we'd even have a wet Navy in a world that has FTL. We've gone back and forth. We came to a compromise, I think. We even did a panel on this a couple months ago about how wet is your space Navy. That was sparked by your and I's argument. And we're like, let's get other people's opinion that have, informed ideas about this because they're in the military themselves, or at least they think about these subjects. And by the way, we'll record it for everyone else to listen to as well. Unfortunately, you came down hard sick with that, so you didn't get to make that discussion, but you got to watch it later. But you start thinking about those ideas because, again, if this, then that, and if that, then what? Which is a lot of fun. But the other part of this story that I think greatly changed as far as my perspective from when I wrote it the first time, obviously my prose have gotten better and yours are better than where I was when I wrote it the first time. So that changed the tone overall, just improving the writing, tightening up the sentences. I mean, that alone will change a story. I come from writing from the academic side. So I was writing history papers. They love a lot of commas and conjunctive clauses. I had to learn through a very hardcore editor that, JR, no more than 2 commas a sentence. If you need more, make 2 sentences.
Or use a semicolon.
Or semicolon. But even with the semicolon, you still are limited on the after the semicolon, the number of, 1, 2, or 3 choices.
Let's use an M dash.
You love the M dash. So for me, I love the ellipses over the M dash. You can kind of use them interchangeably most of the time. We generally have a rule since my mom does the baseline edit for us before it goes to an editor, is that she's the deciding factor because she doesn't agree with me or you all the time. So it's okay. And neither of us care that much. Mostly we argue in the comments because it's fun. And we did learn communication, the value of that, because sometimes I would change things and you wouldn't know why, or you'd change things I didn't know why. So somewhere along the lines of the third time we had to call over relatively minor shit, let's just start putting, if we change it, why. And then if you don't like
how the margins, it'll be fine.
Right. But then if you have to change it, if you knew what the if was, you could change it from what it originally was, which obviously there was a problem for one of us there, to the end goal, what we were trying to do. Because sometimes, if, we're trying to set something up later, or it's a military tactic thing, obviously you have to adjust for that. How do you do that, though, was what was always up in the air. So by communicating better, I think the story overall improved from our 3rd and 4th pass.
Oh, I certainly think it did. It was my writing overall improved because of the process.
I think mine did too. And I've worked with a lot of editors between when I wrote this the first time and now. So, and I've heard other authors that come back and re-edit older works say the same thing, but there's almost like there were 3 authors in this: J.R. Handley from 2016, J.R. Handley from now, and you.
Yeah.
Which gets weird. Although I just, if it's a choice between J.R. Handley then and now, I just listen to now because I've worked with a lot of better authors than me that have taught me a thing or two. But speaking of, you can't have a story, because we've talked about the plot in the world, without the characters. So I have a favorite character. For me, it still is John Harden. The basic premise is his dad was a war hero, so he grew up in the shadow of his dad, and he has to live up to, or die trying in his worlds, his dad's image, or not, because the original point was his dad was this super war hero, and he has to live up to the image. You flip that on his axis, and he hates his dad because his dad was just a drunk, and he doesn't know the true story, which he learns later. But still, the idea of a kid growing up under the shadow, good or bad, of their parents and what that means to their future, which I think is kind of a universal story.
Absolutely. Something I've learned over the years is that, especially men, we are 100% shaped by our fathers. We either try very much to be who our dad was, or who we think our dad is, or we try very hard to be nothing like the man. Like I've never met a dude who was a happy medium in there. Either he was trying like hell to be exactly like his old man, or trying like hell to be nothing like him. And so I thought it would be interesting to give Harden an absent father who was a war hero, but he didn't know he was a war hero until he gets to the Legion and runs into people that served with his old man. And he finds out that his old man was a war hero, and he's got something to live up to.
And the other part of that, which I don't think we thought of when we wrote it, is the idea of when you have people that do classified missions, because if you're doing spec ops, most of what they're doing is classified. It'd be years before people could hear it. And we have, in the interest of keeping a story going, we created this magic virus, if you would, symbiote that they ingest, which basically is like super tapeworm, only instead of making them sick, it extends their life. Like obviously a bullet to the head is still going to kill them, but shy of that, like it makes them prolong their life. So it's not quite nanites, but it gave us some of the same cool effects. And so as part of that, obviously they're going to keep things classified longer because people are living longer.
Right.
And what does that do if a guy on a classified mission dies and he's got kids, like kids who will never know what really happened and what that means for the families at home? You almost never hear that discussed. Like you hear the old trope, the hardest job in the Navy or the Army or whatever is the military wife. And, I would hazard a guess getting shot at and blown up is probably harder than staying at home with the kids. Not to denigrate what they do, because what they do allows the other thing to happen. I think they're equally valuable, but on a grander scale of heart, almost dying probably wins hands down.
Yeah, like what happens to those families, though, when dad doesn't come home?
And they don't have answers, because at least like he died storming Hill 321 or whatever. Like you might not agree with the war, you might whatever, but you have answers. You get closure.
Yeah.
What happens when you don't have closure?
Yeah, what you get is the Dagdan Federation version of the Yellow Telegram, and on behalf of a grateful nation, blah 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 blah, and that's it. Like what happens after that?
You see some of that, although we didn't know it at the time because the movie wasn't out when we started the first pass. But like you see some of that with Maverick's character in Top Gun 2, right? Like he didn't know the true story of his dad. And so the idea is that this affects the military kids is not a new idea. We just sort of tried to take a new touch on it. And because we wanted John Harden to be relatable, John is a very common last name. John Doe is often used for unknown person. So I intentionally, when I named him, because you kept this name, John Doe, instead of Doe, obviously I went with Harden because his life was hard because he was an orphan. So John Harden. And I wasn't trying to be too on the nose. I mean, if you didn't know, if I didn't just tell you that, you might not have guessed that. But that was why, because I wanted him to be John Q. Public. I wanted him to be able to have been any one of us.
Yeah, and it worked. But I don't know. I love the character enough.
But who was your favorite character?
Oh man, that's a coin toss for me between Warrant Officer. Crap, my brain will remember his name now. Come on, brain. Oh, I got the TO&E pulled up, so I won't dump all this stuff.
I was getting ready to pull mine up too.
Yeah, Warrant Officer Todd. My favorite is it's a toss-up between Warrant Officer Todd and Corporal Khedive. And I didn't expect Corporal Khedive to be a character that I was going to fall in love with writing him, because in the original story, you kill Corporal Khedive. He doesn't make it. And in my mind, that dude every outfit's got an operator or two in it, right? Like some dude that's always shaving the odds, always looking to make an extra buck, always running a scam. He's the guy, like, if you really need something like a spare pair of boots or you need some equipment to show up, like, Khadiv's the guy you go to. If you don't, as long as you don't ask too many questions about how he got that extra piece of transportation, everything's cool. And so writing that dude, I really fell in love with, Corporal Khadiv. But then also Warrant Officer Todd, but that's because we threw two short stories. We wrote two short stories together about Warrant Officer Hiram Todd. So, like, I've got more time writing him than any other character in the universe that we've created.
I liked him. I didn't tend to him to be much more of a nod to the old ways, to like sort of the grizzled teacher who passes knowledge along. When I originally wrote him, the grandfather in Last Airbender, he's got that famous line: "You keep knowledge keeps chasing you, and you keep outrunning it," kind of thing. It's right. Hero, I think's his name. Hiro.
Maybe.
If you know who he is, dear listener, comment in the section. Tell me what I got wrong. But he's the grandfather of the Fire Lord, the brother of the Fire Lord, the grandfather, or no, I guess uncle of the young Fire Lord Prince. Anyway, in The Last Airbender, I like that character, and so I was trying to recreate him just in better shape, obviously because the guy's old and short and fat, and obviously that wouldn't work in a modern military. But I kind of wanted that ambiance, and you turned him in from like this grandfather to just, isn't ready to retire, but isn't got the fire in his belly anymore, into something entirely different, which I really liked. You went more for the old adage, just because there's snow on the roof doesn't mean there's not a fire in the furnace approach to this guy.
What's that line? Be wary of old men and be wary of old men in job. Yeah, be wary of old men in a job where men don't get old.
Yeah, and so I like the way you changed him, but that was not my intent with him going on. And so some of the characters existed just for, I wanted them to serve one purpose. And some of that was kind of surface level, and you added depth to a lot of it that I liked. Just because we were, because I was so focused on this part of the story, I didn't focus on this. And because you came in and part A was already written, you had time to focus on the other parts, which overall created, I think, a better layered picture.
Yeah, I really liked writing Warren Todd, and I really liked writing Corporal Khadiv, but I also enjoyed writing Corporal Lang. Like, everybody's served with that one dude or chick that is damn good at the job. They know they're good at it, and they're assholes about it. They're like freaking Hangman from Top Gun Maverick, or Iceman from the original Top Gun. They're good, they know they're good, and they're pricks about it, and they make your life miserable. But boy, was she fun to write.
The other one that was, speaking of Hiram Todd, going back to him, though, that we butted heads against a little bit, and we finally compromised, difference in a formal text versus dialogue, is in the Navy, warrant officers are just called warrant as their rank. In the Army, we would call them chief warrant officer or chief informally. And so the idea of just calling someone warrant, like warrant what? There are several grades. It felt so wrong to me that we finally compromised. It was like, well, we'll keep the ambiance in dialogue, but in the written text, we'll just spell it out so that way we don't alienate readers that are coming from various service branches or whatever. And I thought that was a pretty good compromise, because you can do whatever you want in dialogue. That's just how that character speaks.
Yeah.
So what about secondary characters? I have mine that you added to the story, but what were your favorite secondary characters?
Oh, probably freaking the aircraft mechanic guy, Odecker.
That's funny, because the aircraft mechanics were my favorite secondary characters too, just because like you have them like borrowing and stealing parts from this aircraft to fix this one, and then, oh shit, now we want this one to fly, but I've already rated all the parts, so now I have to go to a different plane and raid that parts, which I thought was kind of cool. And then one of the things, I mean, I've seen Top Gun, so I know what they walk the flight line to make sure there's nothing on the ground that could cause issues.
Right.
But I've never worried about that in a story. I mean, obviously we do that in the Army for like policing up brass and litter, but if you miss something, the world doesn't end. In a Navy context, it can, because that stuff can go into engines. And so you had that scene where the one younger petty officer drops the rags, and he can't find all of them.
Yeah, Lozo can't find all of his rags.
And he's afraid he might have like sealed that engine up with a rag in there somewhere. Which I thought that scene just popped for me. I could picture it in my head, and them complaining about the box lunches, and one of the lines, something to the effect, and I don't remember how because it's been edited so many times, but the basic effect is if they're giving us this kind of lunch, it means they're going to work the dog shit out of us and make our lives miserable.
Yeah, box lunches means we're screwed. Like that's really the way it is, man. If you're getting ready to do flight ops and somebody calls up and like, "Hey, bro, don't worry about chow. We got box lunches ordered." You know your day is going to be long and painful.
The opposite of that in the infantry and in the combat arms, if they feed you really well, you know shit's about to get real. Because, this is the proverbial last meal. Like the one time we got venison when I was in Iraq right before we did a hard push, I'm like, I know I'm not going to like what comes next. Because,
the Navy's equivalent of that is to serve you steak and lobster. And then right after that, they tell you your deployment's been extended by 7 months.
So I think some of those little details are what made the story pop for me that we both brought in from our various branch of service. And then we have a friend, Christopher Denote is an author as well as a retired Air Force officer. So when we wanted to mix like the Air Force space stuff in with the Navy, so it had a little bit unique flavor, we had people we could call, which I thought was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
My other favorite secondary character, and I can't remember which one it was. I know our publisher Scott got a cameo with his given name, not his publisher name.
As a signed T-Bucket.
Yep. But I like the scene where they come across the essentially the drop ship, and this corporal is like, I don't care if I'm going to get the lash, because in this world, obviously, like the lash still exists. Like they get whipped if they F up, right? And so he's like, I'm going to tell this lieutenant off or ensign or whatever he was, because he's a moron and he needs to know he's a moron, and I need to be the one to tell him he's a moron. And the other guy was like, you could get the lash for this, and he's like, you know what? It's worth it.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Off on that officer, and
you choose out the lieutenant.
Yeah, and then the petty officers and spacers, I think we call this unrated ranked seamen, that are the gunners on this craft, that are like, I'm afraid to get involved in this because this guy's got a weapon and he's pointing it our way and he looks like he has no S to give. So you see like all of the gunners just sort of quietly like backing away, like exit stage right.
Yeah. Corporal Kniev is bent out of shape because the Navy guys are supposed to be guarding the rear, and they're not guarding the rear. They're friggin', goofing off and shooting the shit instead of mounted up and ready to fly at a moment's notice. And it really pisses that dude off. Because,
essentially this was a ship. So the basic premise is they find a ship in looking for the missing MacGuffin, the VIP's kid that on a ship that went missing. And if you look at the vastness of space, missing ships are going to be relatively, it's going to happen often enough. It's significant, but statistically not so much, just because of the sheer numbers of ships we're talking about. But if a VIP is on it, that matters. Suddenly they're doing a grid by grid search looking for him. In doing so, they find this ship that was a merchant ship that disappeared, I think we said 20 or 40 years ago. The base idea is the ship was being operated by pirate type individuals that were doing their own thing off the record. In our world, much like the Brits told us not to go west of the Mississippi, at a certain point, the Dagda Federation says, don't go farther than this because we don't have the logistics to support you. And there are other polities surrounding the Dagda Federation in this supercluster. And so some of these people decide not to listen, and hence clandestine stuff. So all the sailors think this is a milk run. It's just an abandoned ship. We'll find some booty we can sell, and because obviously prize ships are a thing. And we'll take it back, and we'll get a little bit of the loot, and that's it. So they like literally thought it was a nothing run. And obviously when you think that, that's when stuff always goes badly.
Right.
Which was a lot of fun. I like how you kind of turn some of those tropes on their head, not necessarily in the way like I'm subverting expectations just because. It's more you applied real world logic to tropes that were common from people who never wore a uniform.
Yeah.
And it was always fun to see. So like we actually did, the thing we complained about, we had the corporal tell off the officer, but then we acknowledge that he knows he's going to pay for this later. He just doesn't care.
Yeah. It's like, maybe so. But that dude's going to have to explain to the captain of the ship why he wasn't suited up and manning his aircraft and, doing his job. So I'll take some lashes for that.
Yeah, and so I thought that was fun. I thought the way we did the culture of the Legion. So my basic premise was in this universe, you and I came up with. So there's the Navy, which includes a special forces type unit. And then there is the Legion, which is the Army meets the Marine Corps. There are not an army per se. There are militia units that would be ground only. In the Dagna Federation, each planet has its own sub-governments. So potentially they have their own standing military, but it's nothing. I mean, it's like the difference between the colonial regulars and the British Hessians or whatever. Like skill sets are totally different. And in a fair fight, they don't stand a chance.
Right.
And so the Army kind of exists in that respect, but mostly it's the Legion and the Navy. We simplified. And then in the Legion, because obviously you still need shipborne fighters versus ground-based fighters, you have the Fleet Legion forces versus the Legion that could be assigned to ground bases, or it hasn't come up in the story, but presumably if we've got floating space stations at like Lagrange points or whatever.
Right.
And so this is we're focusing in this story on the Fleet Legion forces. And so when we were building that culture where they were like, you could challenge someone you didn't like to a fist fight, and as long as you don't damage government property, pretty much all bets are off.
Spot training.
Yeah, spot training. And so like you get back to some of the more brutal, like pre-industrial military stuff just to add flavor to the culture in ways that made it unique. And you think, okay, well, why would they let that happen? Well, if space is a dangerous place, wear a helmet, then you need to make sure the people that are fighting there are tough. And so how do you do that? Well, some of the spot training where I'm mad at Sergeant so-and-so, I'm going to challenge him to this fight in spot training. And we both take our rank off and we have a wrestling match because we're training in hand-to-hand combat, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then you just put rules so nobody dies. Which I thought was
with that symbiote that they pack around, man, they can take some pretty nasty lumps, and it doesn't really degrade their performance as a fighter, and they learn some hard lessons. So like you said, it as a general rule, it sort of creates a culture of toughness within the Legion, so that they're not, like the weak, the unfortunate, and the soft really don't last in the Legion forces unless they find their way into rear echelon jobs somewhere, maybe.
Yeah, or they have the right connections. And so one of the things you did, and I can't remember the character's names, the female corporal, Lang, right?
Yeah, Lang.
She's like kicking ass to some guys that are bigger than her, but it's not because she's stronger. Like we didn't pretend biology doesn't exist, because any benefit she has from the symbiote, the other guy does too.
Yeah, no, it's just like a female Bruce Lee.
It's more like she just outsmarts them, but she's not smart like Andrew, was it the smart guy in the Stargate universe, right? You know what I'm talking about? Daniel Jones? Is Daniel something?
Yeah. The professor.
The professor guy, right? Like she's not smart in that way. She's smart like cunning like a fox. Yeah, and so the running joke is you never want to play poker against her because she can read micro expressions in ways that are uncanny. So she doesn't have to outfight them. She just has to outsmart them, and she does often. And I like that because I like seeing strong female characters. They're fun to write. Obviously, we fell in love with Xena for a reason, but I don't want to strain incredulity by having like this 5'0", 100-pound soaking wet lady beat up Goliath just because.
No,
right?
Lang's not like 5'0". Like she's a solid 6 foot.
True. I mean, which makes her a statistical anomaly even in this universe. But I just meant in general. Like we acknowledge still there's biological differences. So she just outsmarts them. She just outsmarts them. And I like doing that. And we didn't write her as just a dude with tits. Like she's fully feminine as well as, because when she wants to, so in the beginning, it's an opening scene. So we're not spoiling anything. John is a new corporal, and she's the senior corporal, one due next for promotion. And so her job is sort of to shepherd him as the new NCO and teach him how to do the NCO part. And obviously, there's book training, but applying that practically is where he fails in the beginning. And so it's her job to train him. And so when she wants to get in his head during this fight, which he's challenging her because he's mad that she's always busting his chops. So she actually plays up the seductress angle to mess with his head and then slams his ass on the ground. I was laughing so hard when you added that in. I had to stop reading and take a breather because it was so funny. So speaking of that scene, obviously we mentioned seduction. We don't have any sex that was unseen. We don't plan on it. We might mention that it happens because, young service people do the deed. Babies are made. Obviously, this universe is heavily populated. But what would you consider the rating of this novel if we're doing like a PG or like a movie rating system?
Man, like right on the borderline between like PG-13 and R, because the language sort of
And the
pushes
violence.
us over. Like
violence.
Language and violence pushes over into the R category, I think.
Yeah, and I would say R just because to go for expectations, because some of our stories are going to be darker than others.
Yeah. There's some stuff we're going to explore that would certainly make it not PG-13 compatible.
Including the aforementioned, we mentioned the cannibal race, the Batavi, that come up in the short story. As we wrote that short story, just to expand on some of our characters, you and I have decided that at some point in time, we do need to tell the story of the Batavi War where they fight the cannibals.
Not once, but twice.
Right. And the Batavi are also some of the transhumanists. So they like do some weird stuff. And so because that's going to be part of the universe, that is obviously, if you're talking about humans eating humans, it's going to be a lot darker than this story. And so obviously to set expectations, I'd say the series is probably going to stay R. I don't see any reason why we would throw relations into it. I don't think it serves this universe.
I'm very much a fade to black kind of guy.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We can mention that it happens if it serves the plot, whatever. And I don't mind that. I'm not going to shy away from the fact that humans do that, but it's going to happen off scene.
Yeah. I'm not writing spicy space opera. I just don't think I don't think I have the toolbox to write that. Like, it's just not.
Oh, that's what your other name. Hillbilly told me you wrote as Chuck Tingle for some of your other books.
Chuck Tingle.
Okay, I kid. I think an AI
fits well.
Right. I think an AI writes those, but that's besides the point. But anyway, so I would say the universe, generally speaking, is R. This book, probably PG-13, except for it's got a little bit of violence in the language. Although we're realistic with the violence in that there's not like we do this thing and there's no consequences. So it's not going to tell people it's fun to go beat people up because we show what happens when you get in those fights to you as well.
I mean, I don't know. I'm interested in telling stories, not violence for violence sake.
Same.
Like I want to tell stories about big damn heroes doing heroic stuff, and there's consequences for those things.
So for me, I kind of agree with you.
Heroes.
And obviously, we mentioned this is part of a series. So the first book is Ghostship Derelict. The second book, which again is basically half written, is Ghostship Prize. And the idea is they find a second ship, and so the prize in the military naval parlance back in the day, a prize ship was one you captured from the enemy, and then you could tow it to port or put a prize crew on it and drive it to port if that's an option, and salvage it. And then the crew, so the captain gets a share, the officers get it, the other officers get a share, then senior enlisted, and then the rank and file. And there's percentages and procedures. We didn't dive into that because it's not really germane to the story. But the idea is obviously the ship that looks like it's going to be this valuable, everyone's going to get rich off of this. And so they go on the prize ship and shenanigans happen. So that's the second book. And then the third book is Ghostship Adrift. So what happens once they're on the prize ship? Well, you can kind of guess. Since we mentioned it's Voyager meets SGU meets BSG as our undertones.
What happens when your prize ship has a mind of its own?
And we're not saying literally it's got a mind of its own. No spoilers. No. We're just, in general, like ships are run by computer programs even today. And sometimes those routines happen over and over again, even long after the crew is dead. That's a common trope in sci-fi.
Yeah.
It just keeps repeating itself because that was its last standing order. So we kind of play with those ideas. And then where the series goes from there, we kind of have general ideas. But again, sometimes as you write, you make significant enough changes that you kind of tilt left when you meant to go straight or right.
Or you screw around and give a commissar more of a role than he was supposed to have. Yeah.
Yeah. So this series was originally planned at like 4 or 5 books. As far as outlines goes, we're up to 7. So I guess that makes it a Bane trilogy, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It potentially goes longer. And it's not so much like a lot of people say, oh, if the sales, we're too slow to use that as a good metric. I think in hindsight, we'll look back, oh, we made X amount of dollars off the series. we're not going to see in real time just because we're not writing it like rapid release.
Hey man,
So
I'm looking forward to buying some value menu meals with the money from this series, man.
Absolutely. And you know what? If you're a good boy, we might even supersize it. Do they still do that? Is that a thing? I don't know. I haven't eaten McDonald's in years.
I don't know. I just get the $5 meal deal and move on, man.
Yeah. So for us, we made this agreement, you and I have a general standing rule with my readers that I will not leave a series unended. Sometimes my ending gets more abrupt than I planned, but it will get an ending that fits the story as written. And so like I had to do that with the Sleeping Legion. Originally it was going to be 6 books. And when the universe that it was in had a change that then affected me because I was writing in his universe, the books became 4 and I ended it. But I promise you will get an ending. So when this grows or doesn't, it will be entirely based on the needs of the story. And so obviously sales factor in, but I mean, we're both small fish at the moment, so I don't think it's a huge factor right now.
No. I mean, I'm working a day job and writing, early in the mornings to get these things done, and I don't see any reason to not.
Which is ironic because I write at night. So often as I'm logging off to go to bed, you're logging on. It's like, oh, hey, go to sleep now. And I'm like, oh, hey, good morning now.
It's like high five on the way by.
Right, because you're like up at 4 a.m. And generally I write in the night when it's quietest. So like from midnight to 4 is when I'm writing.
Which is the same reason why I'm up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when it's absolute quietest in my house. Like everybody else is asleep. I can get up, have some coffee. My brain works better early in the day than it does later in the day. So
I'm actually having to change my writing time to get earlier because I find I write better just as a product of the TBI. I write better on days that I take the time to exercise. So I do my steps. And so when I get up, because, we live in the South, it gets hot. I found on days when I got up earlier and just knock my walk up as the sun rises and just knock it out, like I'm twice as productive those days. And so I'm trying to get my body used to waking up. But for a while, I was doing virtual assistant work for European authors. And so I was on their schedule and they're +5 for us, just England. And then the farther you go into Europe, the more the deviation. And I did one from a guy that was an American, but he was living in the Middle East as a contractor. So he didn't want to do the back end. So I was doing some of his back end stuff. So they're +12 and I had to be available when he was awake. So I did that for so many years. I quit all those jobs to focus on our stories. But I did it for so many years. It's a pain in the butt to adjust my sleep schedule.
Yeah.
So slowly but surely, we might actually be able to like communicate in real time as we're both writing in the morning.
We'll see.
Obviously, as we wrap this up, was there anything about this book in the series and the universe sort of in general that we didn't cover that you think the reader needs to know to dive in?
The only thing I would suggest to the readers and it's not really that you need to know to dive in, but it's worth your time to go ahead and track down and read, is the Letter of Mark short story in Assault Team Volume 1. That's the name of that, right?
Yep, I'm pretty sure. I will track them up and I'll link them in the show notes.
J.R. Handley presents Assault Team Volume 1. Because that is the origin story for Warrant Officer Todd. And then when Volume 2 goes ahead and hits the shelves, whenever that happens to be, the story, The Infinite Horizon Affair, is how Warrant Officer Todd goes from being, Master Sergeant Todd to Warrant Officer Todd, goes from being in the Legion to being in the Navy and aboard the Nathaniel B. Hughes, which leads you to the beginning of Ghostship.
Absolutely. And then I like some of the Navy stuff you brought in was like organizing the actual fighter squadrons and some of those scenes. Like we have a short story on the contested landing. It's about Lunar Lions. They're basically a fighter squadron. And it's not tied to this ship. It's just in this world. But you see how the pilots and the pilots flying the drop vessels interact with the Fleet Legion forces in that, and also the role of Tech and Dumb Luck, because that was the one when we hinted at you throw in Tech's complications where I would have just had them, have enemy complications.
Right.
And overall, the story is short story, but it's very compelling, and that'll be coming out it's in Contested Landing. If you want to read some of the universe stuff, There is a short story called LZ New Birth. It is out in this universe because I wrote it when I wrote it the first time. After I took the universe from Chris Winder and it was just mine. It was in the Expanding Universe anthology series that Craig Martell used to do. Was his way of paying it forward and showcasing new authors. It's still out there. At some point in time, David and I are going to unpublish that and then make it fit the new world. But for now, it's not canon. But I think it kind of gets the bones of the universe.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's out there as well. I don't think there's anything else that's in this world specifically. Maybe there's some more short stories, but I think I've unpublished some of those. I know you've got a stack of them that you're going to write over so we can add them to as bonus content for once we get cranking.
Yeah. There's
I'm pretty sure most of those were unpublished though.
But for readers that want to get like really kind of get a good feel for the universe and the story arc, like those 3 anthologies and Ghostship are definitely the way to go.
Absolutely. So obviously this is the part of the interview where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book. So seriously, it does matter, especially when you've got new authors like us. So I'm going to show you why we're doing that. The entirety of the cover, because I like, we got the Three Ravens logo. I like what they did on the spine. And then we've got some of our reviews to show that reviews matter. One of the reviews that David put this together from our Amazon reviews is it's like Aliens meets Halo ODST at an Honor Harrington convention, which like that just tickled me pink. And then my other favorite was They Get It, right? Marines Marine and Sailors Squid. So obviously, if you're looking at it and you haven't read it, those kinds of reviews can kind of tell you what to expect. So once you read it, share your thoughts as well. We greatly appreciate it. Right now, this book is wide. So wherever you bought the book, Barnes & Noble website, Walmart for the digital copy, Ingram Sparks website, I think you can buy it. It's everywhere where you can buy books. And yes, audio will be coming out. I don't know when. If you follow the Three Ravens Discord and their company site, there's been a slowdown right now because of life issues with some of the owners, but they aren't ignoring us. We just opted to stay with them when they offered us the right to bow out and go to another publisher, just because we realize it's going to be a slow process, and I'm not worried about marketing it crazy until we get deeper in anyway. Because it's just a hard sell for people where there's only one book. They've been burned by too many writers that never finish.
Yeah.
And so, but it's with them. At some point in time, there will be audio as well. But wherever you buy it, leave a review. They really do matter. With that, you mentioned that we are both slow rolling this book around our other writing schedule. What are you writing right now?
Well, I'm working on book 2 for the Car Wars series. It's called Chicago Style. And I'm also, I wish, no, Chicago Style refers to the sort of the final challenge that the hero will have to face when he gets from Memphis to Chicago, as part of the Dead Man's Run. Okay.
And that's the Car Wars universe, which is owned by Steve Jackson. And he's the owner of GURPS, which is the General Universal Role-Playing System.
Yep. My second favorite role-playing system of all time.
Yeah. It's a little too crunchy for me. I like a little simpler. I'm a simple guy. I have simple tastes. And so you're working on that. And that's contractual with the timeline for production. So because you and I are doing this almost as a passion project, we don't have the timeline. So you and I said, hey, let's get you the contract where you have a finish date that's due by. Knock that out first.
Yeah, I definitely want to get that Dead Man's Run stuff knocked out, and then that's also kind of a slow roll because there's 4 other authors writing in the series, and so once mine is out, like there's 2 or 3 other authors of the books who have to get written and released before I'm due to write book 3. Go ahead. Well, which gives me a window to crank out another Ghostship book.
Absolutely. And it helps that, we have, like I said, you had the rough draft that you're able to pull from.
Yeah.
Although, because we've made so many changes, it's not a instant 1-for-1 because you do have to make adjustments. But I still think having the first draft there helps both of us.
Absolutely.
And so,
it almost functions like a super detailed outline in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And so for me, I am working on the series I was writing with James Ward, the Curse Brigade series, and I am writing when that's done. I also had started a Gamelit series with him at the same time because James worked many projects at once. And that obviously will happen after, but I did lose a lot of time in August when we're recording this at the end of the month. You'll hear this in the beginning of October, but I lost a lot of time. I had surgery, removed the last of the shrapnel from my leg, and it got infected, and I was out for a good long while. And so unfortunately my writing slowed down briefly, but I am back on the wagon. Bit the bullet, bought Dragon again because the Word version of the audio dictation is not as good. And so I'm working on that right now, and that'll be coming out hopefully soon. Although because I've been slow and my own life got in the way with production issues, in all fairness, I don't blame them. The Wargate Publishing will wait until I finish the series and then they will publish it. So there will be a delay. I'm halfway through book 2 though. It's going to be a trilogy. And I'm finding how spoiled I was when I was writing that with James, because a lot of the gods and all that lore that comes into the story, like I didn't have to research anything. I just called him. And now that he's not here, I'm like, crap, I got to Google stuff and find papers and try to get it right. And because that stuff existed for so long, it's like, okay, well, what version of this god? Because like with the Egyptian Empire, like it was a long time.
Yeah. Pick your era.
Right. And so I found that I was spoiled working with him. Pleasure of my life, though. But that'll be coming out at their discretion once I finish it. And like I said, don't blame them. They bent over backwards working with the stuff that was happening in my life. Got nothing but love for them. But that's what I'm working on. Now, if they want to stalk you, I mean follow you on the internet, where can they find you?
You can find me at David Hensley Writes on Facebook. Get in there. Track down my Facebook group, Hensley Station. That's where I sort of focus all of the yapping and information, updates about what's going on with the stories that I'm telling. You can find me on my website at davidwhensley.com. I'm also over on the website formerly known as Twitter as D Hensley Writes, same on Instagram. Track me down there. If you really want like a steady drip of information on the stories that I'm telling, go to my website, sign up for my newsletter. You'll get at least one of those a month, probably more than that as things release, as updates, but I promise not to like clobber your inbox. I'm not one of those guys that has time to write books and short stories and a newsletter a week. There's not enough hours in the day for me. So the newsletter is the thing that happens the least, but still happens about once a month, if that's your cup of tea.
Yeah. And so you can find me on my website, jrhandley.com. I link to all the things there. I am on Instagram, which is mostly just memes and occasional book covers with a link, and Facebook as JR Handley as well. Anywhere I'm on the internet, it says JR Handley. I'm simple that way. I didn't get too creative. I just use my name. So you can find me there, and you can find the podcast at Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the bits, shoots, the rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters. We've got our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. We've got our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com, for professional purposes only, people. Save the shenanigans for Madam Stabby Stab over on the Twitter, Instagram, and her email. We have our website over on podcasters.spotify.com. It's a bunch of gobbledygook. Just go to the link tree, click on it. But if you go to our website over there, you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. Every penny counts. These episodes aren't free to produce, and your contributions help keep the lights on. Or you can support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. If you do, be sure to put in the comment sections for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till it pours out of their ears. and then we'll film it and sell that to you too. With that out of the way, speaking of Coffee Brand Coffee, the link is in the show notes. Use the code podcast grunts and you get 10% off. We get a little bit of a kickback. You get a discount. It's a win-win. And from there, I realized as part of the religion question, I didn't ask you, coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Coffee with heavy cream and honey.
Oh, honey. Oh, go on. I don't think I've ever tried it that way. You add just a little bit of honey, a lot of honey?
Probably maybe a tablespoon of honey.
And does that just act as sugar, or does it add flavor?
That adds sweet and a little bit of flavor. Like, if you're not used to it, you'll notice it right away. I've been drinking honey in my coffee ever since I got diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So it's a more diabetic-friendly sweetener. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of the artificial sweeteners they're finding are not that great for you.
Nope.
Like the Sweet and Low and all those others. Although you and I are both old enough, we've watched them go back and forth a dozen times on whether eggs were going to cause cancer or not. So take that with a grain of salt. But generally speaking, according to the nutritionist the VA hooked me up with, if you can't pronounce the ingredients, probably not the best for you.
Yep,
so that's my rule of thumb.
You shouldn't share ingredients with jet fuel.
Exactly. And so I have been drinking. When I bought it, I bought a whole bunch because I know they do seasonal limited runs. But I've been still drinking the S'mores coffee by Coffee Brand Coffee. When I'm not drinking that, I like the 8 o'clock coffee brand French vanilla. And then I'll drink that with French vanilla creamer. No more sugar because I used to add sugar to the creamer. And like I was basically drinking a Big Mac in a cup. 8 ounces of Big Mac with all the calories, not as much of the satiation. So I cut back like half as much creamer and no sugar. And so obviously I keep the calories low. It's summer while we're recording this, so I've been doing a lot of iced coffee. But you're going to be listening to this in October, so, I'm a basic white bee. So in October, it's all about the pumpkin spice latte. I love it. I know I'm so basic, but I like what I like. I just wish I found a local place that made it as good as the Starbucks generally does because I hate supporting Starbucks. I'd rather support local.
Me too.
And speaking of supporting local, Coffee Brand Coffee is an American company. They employ American citizens. It is not a drop ship company. They actually buy the beans and then roast them themselves here in the U.S. So if that matters to you, that's a good deal. Unfortunately, at the moment, they do not ship international. So if you're not in the contiguous United States, I don't think you can buy from them. They're talking about changing that. So, that may change by the time this episode airs. But and what is the name, if you're in the Hampton Roads area, that local coffee shop that we met at, I can't remember the name, that supports the local autism society.
Oh, with Hickory Trading Company.
If you're in the Hampton Roads area, Hickory Trading Company, worth the visit. Couch was comfortable. The pastries were fresh baked and the service was impeccable. They hire a lot of the disabled adults to give them, actual job and gainful employment. And they're super friendly. All of the staff there, I absolutely love it. So if you're in the area, I definitely say stop on. We're not sponsored with her, the lady that owns it. We just think it's super cool.
Yeah, it's a great place. And again, if I'm going to spend money, I'd rather spend money local.
Or if nothing else, just with people that don't hate me.
That too. Local and people that don't hate me. That's a good combo.
Absolutely. And with that, I will say thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my absentee co-host, I am J.R. Handley. This was the Blasters and Blade podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you for coming on, David. This was a lot of fun. I told you that when Nick couldn't make it, that this was going to run long because we didn't have adult supervision. So in our defense, It's not our fault. He left us on supervision. That's all
right. Gives me an excuse to sleep into the morning.
Absolutely. All right. With that, I'm going to hit the end button. Don't cuss yet. Wait for